Hello and welcome to Ask John. I believe this is the 15th episode. This might be episode 15. Maybe it's 16. I'm not sure. I'm losing track. And it's a nice thing to lose track of something that you enjoy doing. I started this show with the idea that this was going to be an interview show where people would come on and ask John some questions. Oh, by the way, I'm John Reuscher, and I'm so glad you joined us today. The first show went like that. I invited a guest, and that guest asked me some financial questions, since I'm a financial advisor. And I thought it would move along that way in future episodes. But as it turned out, I kept inviting these really interesting guests, and I wanted to be asking the questions. I wanted to hear from them. And so today is, well, I was going to say today is an exception. No, today is another exception, exactly. Another exception where I'm going to ask questions. And I have a very interesting guest today. Michael Landram has been a friend of mine for many years. He is a member, as I am, of the Rotary Club of Novato Sunrise. I know him there. And recently I joined an organization called Sons in Retirement and ran into Michael shortly after a couple of fires that occurred. Now, Michael has had a career in forestry in the federal government. And so after these devastating fires occurred, one of them was in Lake County, the Mendocino fire, and at the same time we had the Carr fire near Redding. I guess after that or before that we had the Camp fire. A year before that we had the North Bay fire, causing lots of devastation, lots of property damage and loss of lives. And there's a lot of controversy stirring about that. And I asked Michael, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? And he started talking to me, and I thought, wait a minute, you got to come on the show and tell this story. It's very interesting, and I have to say, a bit frustrating at the same time. Michael, this is your chance to present this story one more time. The first question I want to ask, we're just ending winter after a horrible summer of fires. And we're going into the springtime, and summer will be on us in no time at all. Are we going to expect more fires and more devastation?
There will be more fires, that's for sure. There's always fires in the summer in a Mediterranean climate. We don't know where they're going to be. We don't know how much loss of life and property might occur, but for sure there's going to be fires. So here we are in February, and you started this with a question last August. And so in response to your interest, I built a little PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through right now. This has only been shown twice before, each time to a Rotary Club. So let's just get right into it. What I'm doing is sharing a piece of my career with you today. So I was within the world of forestry in a discipline that's called silviculture. So silva is a Latin root word for forest. So silviculture you can think of kind of like agriculture, where agriculture is taking care of crops. Silviculture is taking care of forests. So the title of this presentation, in response to your interest with fires, is Prescribing Silvicultural Treatments to Moderate Large Wildfire Behavior. So let's talk about right away prescribing and treatments. That sounds like medicine, doesn't it?
That does sound like medicine.
Sounds like medicine. Well, silviculture borrows terminology from medicine. So there is a prescription, and it's a prescription for a treatment, and it's intended to have a result. And in this case, we're going to talk about treatments that just moderate large wildfire behavior, and how would that look? So let's move on. And we can say that a prescription is just a plan of action that changes the forest from a current condition to some desired condition. In this case, one that can handle wildfires better. In order for a prescription or a treatment plan to be effective and really work, it's got to pass 3 tests. It has to be biologically feasible, it has to be economically feasible, and it has to be socially feasible.
Well, I'm with you there, except for the socially feasible. Why on earth would there be any controversy about protecting the forest from devastating fires?
Well, everybody has concerns about what's going on in the environment and about potential practices that would be used to do something. a plan might involve the use of fire, where you purposely set fire to the forest. Now, if you happen to live right next door to where that fire is going to be set, you're going to have concerns. Is this fire going to get out of control? Is it going to accidentally burn up my house? Is it going to put smoke up in the air?
You have to have some trust in the authorities,
You
don't
have
you?
to have some trust.
Yeah,
You know, so that's an example.
yeah, I understand.
And we'll get into that a
Okay.
little bit deeper here. So let's go on. So let's talking about the biological feasibility first. Plants are adapted to fire. California has a Mediterranean climate, which means it gets dry every single summer, and fire is a dominant feature of that climate. So climate drives the evolution of plants over a millennium, and the plants are evolved with and they're adapted to fires. So the frequency and the severity of fire in California forests is more altered than any other feature of the forest environment, starting with European settlement. I want to say that one more time for emphasis here. The frequency and the severity of fire in California forests, it's more altered than any other feature of the forest environment, starting with European settlement. So that's important to understand. Forests generally respond to the absence of fire by getting denser. So in the photographs that are up above, we're looking at a view across the Nevada watershed, across Novato. The view is of Mount Burdell. The top picture was taken about 100 years ago, and the bottom picture was taken by me. And so if you don't focus on the houses and the orchards being gone, but instead look at the back, look at Mount Burdell itself, and I think you can see that there's more trees than there was 100 years ago, and they're in about the same place, but they're denser. And so that's an example of a response to an absence of fire. A more dramatic one can be taken from this scene that you see here, where there was a good part of this hillside in 1910 that was grass, and now it's occupied by trees in
And
1980.
would some people say that's a good thing, to have more dense foliage, more?
Some would, and some would say no.
Okay.
But this is what has happened, and
Okay,
it's
this-
happened
these are
across
just the facts.
across the West.
These are just the facts.
Just the
Okay,
facts.
This is the condition, okay.
Okay, let's talk for a minute about the fire triangle. So you need three things for a fire to happen, right? You need oxygen, you need heat, and you need fuel. So if you have a denser forest, it has more fuel. And let's try to characterize that fuel in three ways. There can be what we'll call surface fuel. That's the fuel that's down on the ground. It's laying on the ground. It's plants that are growing really close to the ground, or it's material that's fallen, dead organic matter.
Okay.
That's on the surface. So imagine that a little fire can get started in surface fuel, and then the flames grow. And then it can get into what we're going to characterize as ladder fuel. And that would be the shrubs that are growing close to the ground and the short trees that are going close to the ground that could then catch on fire from the surface fuels.
This is what some people call the new growth.
Newer growth.
That newer growth.
Or
okay.
plants that are older, but they just happen to be
They just-
short
okay,
plants,
okay.
shrubs.
Okay.
And then imagine that the fire could get in there, and the flames could get even taller, and then it could reach into the topmost layer of fuel, which we're going to characterize as crown fuel, and that'll be the leaves and the branches of the taller trees.
This is the ladder concept that you're talking
The
about.
laddering concept.
Okay.
So knowing that, you can then devise a plan that will rearrange those fuels to try to make a difference. So these treatments can try to reduce the amount, or they can reduce the distribution of surface fuels and ladder fuels and crown fuels, and thereby change fire behavior.
Okay.
So here's an example on the Mendocino National Forest. This is a place where I was involved in a thinning operation some years ago that was intended in part to moderate wildfire behavior. And then last summer in the Mendocino complex, that place burned. And so I went up there September, October last year, and took these photographs. And it's an example of how on the left, untreated, the crown fuels, the surface fuels, the ladder fuels, they're dense, they're close together. On the right is the area that I was involved in a thinning operation there. The work had all been done, and then the fire comes through, and there are surviving trees there. So it's a demonstration of how this kind of thing works.
And the concept is to clean the low debris and does that include pulling bushes and?
It does.
Yeah.
One way or another,
And,
you know.
And the younger trees, you take the younger trees down? Is that
Take younger trees,
part of
take
it?
older trees, thin them out, space them out,
Yeah. So I can
and you
see
end
why-
up with less
some,
fuel.
Some people might have an objection to cutting down some new.
Some
new
people
young trees.
object to cutting down trees.
Okay, well, I get that.
Okay, well, that's an example that can be done on a small scale, on a stand. This graphic up here is the result of some research work that tries to operate at a landscape scale or a large scale. And so it takes a little bit of explaining to do this. If we can just look at this part of this graphic, this is a model. And it's a model of a fire that would start here in a situation that's untreated. No work has been done. And so this indicates how the fire would spread and how intense it would be and how far it would go. Now these other 1, 2, 3, go ahead.
Okay, I'm looking at that, and I can't tell whether that is horizontal or vertical. Does that make sense?
You're looking down from the top, from up above. You're
Okay,
in a,
so it's
you're in a plane
horizontal. We're
flying
looking
over.
at the path of the fire.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So in these other 3 examples, random, strips, and strategic, what's been done is a simulation of treating 20% of the landscape. In other words, surface, ladder, crown fuels have been treated on 20% of the total landscape.
Treated means removed.
Or in some way changed, yes. Changed the
Okay.
distribution, yes.
Okay.
But what's different between these 3 is the pattern. In this first example, the treatments are randomly placed across the landscape. In this middle one, they are done in horizontal strips. And in this last one,
And are those
they're
strips,
in a herringbone arrangement.
how do you decide if those strips are going north, south, east, west?
Well, this is theoretical and it's modeled. So how it would happen in a real forest would depend on a whole bunch of other
And
variables.
you run into factors of what direction the wind is blowing most of the time.
Where do the
Is it-
fires come from?
Yeah.
You know, what are the wind direction and speeds to be expected? How steep is it? Who owns the land?
Yeah.
What's growing there?
And so the strips idea is, what would be the word for it? It seems like it wouldn't have if the wind was blowing across the strips instead of over the strips, you'd have a different
It
result.
wouldn't work.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
see why the herringbone.
So in this model with the strips, the fire starts there and blows that way.
Right. But if the fire was going to blow.
If it started there
west,
and blew that
yeah,
way, this wouldn't work.
Yeah. So I see the herringbone is well, you name that strategic.
Yeah. And to test this theory, it's been done first in grass on flat ground.
Okay.
And then fires started on purpose
Yeah.
with known wind speeds and known wind directions.
How big an area would you test that on?
5 to 10 acres.
Okay. And that's enough to.
It's enough.
Yeah.
The original tests, and they do result in the display that you see here. When they're placed randomly, they lower the intensity of the fire, but it's not much different than if you didn't treat it at all. The strips can reduce the area that's burned, and so can the herringbone. So that's a landscape scale.
And the herringbone, if let's say the wind's blowing north-south in that example, it looks to me it'd be just about as effective if it was blowing east-west.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the advantage of that
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
the strips.
Okay. All right. Well,
Okay,
excellent.
so you have a small scale example and a large
So
scale
now-
example of
now
how
I'm an
this might
expert.
work.
Huh?
Now you too can take the test and
Okay.
maybe be a silviculturist someday.
And all of you as well. You're keeping notes.
Okay, that was talking about
There's not going to be a test.
biologic
No
feasibility.
Test, right? No test.
Let's talk about
Okay.
the other filter, economic feasibility. So there's costs and there's value in any sort of an economic equation. And on the cost side, in forestry, burning is a relatively cheap thing to do. Manual treatments are very labor intensive and they're costly, and mechanical treatments are also costly. So somehow you have to pay for this. One way to do it is on the value side. If there's enough value of the material being removed that can offset the cost of doing it, that's one way to pass an economic test. And that works only if you're talking about lumber, plywood, particle board products, those kinds of things, which generally come from larger trees. The other material that gets removed, grasses in surface fuel, shrubs and surface fuels, don't generally have enough economic value. Someone has to pay to get to have them removed. Smaller diameter material can sometimes has value in the wood chips that come out that can be used to make electricity or mulch, products like that. But that's the cost value consideration. Another piece of the economic feasibility test is infrastructure. And I mean industrial infrastructure. If you're going to make electricity out of wood chips, then you have to have a manufacturing facility that can do that. If you're going to make saw timber, you have to have sawmills that can do that. And so that's what I mean by the infrastructure. And then if you, there are a variety of subsidies in today's world that could be brought to bear on this too. Grants, carbon offsets, etc. So that's the economic piece. So we've covered the biological test, the economic test, and then let's talk a little bit more about the social test. So if we think about ourselves and the social institutions that we're a part of and where we get our moral, our ethical feelings, and how do they apply to something like a forest or the environment. You know, you're talking about family structures and community structures, government structures, laws and regulations, and so people have concerns. We all have concerns about environmental impacts. And many people have a preference for naturalness when it comes to forests. And so there's a desire to protect the environment from humans. Mm-hmm. So one would want to tread carefully when you're creating a plan to make sure that it passes a social test. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense, but it sounds to me like, no, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. It seems like there's a way to protect the forest from fires, and then there's a different way to protect the forest from clear cutting, for example. And that's the word that comes to mind.
Yes, there are people that are concerned about clear cutting and willing to do whatever it would take to stop it.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we get to a place where we have as much built up fuel, that seems more reasonable to do to prevent the fires to completely destroy the forest. But it's still...
That could be,
still
but it's still a test that has to be passed.
Yeah, it's still not socially acceptable. I
Yeah.
think that's what you're saying, yeah.
And it may be that the social test is the harder of the three to get through. But nonetheless, they're all three there. Okay, so let's take that background. You know, here, this is a silviculturist, what a silviculturist does, the things that you have to think about in making a plan. And then let's just bring that to bear quickly on this fire that happened last fall, the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise. And let's ask ourselves the question, could treatments have changed the behavior of the campfire? Okay? Here we go.
Okay.
All right. A little bit of landscape history. These are aerial photographs on the left from 1984, on the right from 2018. And if you look closely, you can see changes across that period of time, like openings in 1984 that are no longer openings. Or you can see fairly dense forest in here that is no longer fairly dense over here.
Is that because it burned out?
This is a result of a fire,
Okay.
of a previous fire.
Okay.
So another way of looking at it on a more complicated diagram is all those little crosshatches are past fires. And I always get nervous when I'm looking at a landscape where I don't see crosshatches, places that have not burned for a while, because that suggests that there's a buildup of fuels, and they're the places that are ripe for the next one. And guess what? This void right here is the town of Paradise.
Was the town of Paradise. Yeah, that's...
Okay, so here's another graph that kind of shows the same thing. That fire that happened in the past, that was 2008. So it was 10 years ago. And it was called the Butte Lightning Complex. The campfire started over in here and burned across that country and into Paradise. It did it, and it did it very fast. As I understand it, in about an hour and a half, that fire moved 8 miles.
And somebody asked you a question. I remember you were presenting this to one of the Rotary groups, and someone asked the question, did the fire move because of the wind, or did the wind move because of the fire? I didn't understand the question, so I hope you'll explain the question before you answer it.
It didn't start because of the wind, but it moved that fast because of the wind.
And does the fire create its own wind?
It can.
Okay, it can.
Yes,
okay.
It can. But we can also see from this aerial photograph that it came across multiple different kinds of forest conditions as it went those 8 miles in an hour and a half. There's a dense cover of forest. This is not dense at all. There's hardly any trees here. And it came across that, then back into trees again, then back into a place where there's not much trees, across a river and into Paradise.
Wow.
PG&E did a filing with the Public Utilities Commission that day in the morning that talked about their transmission lines and how it was 6:15 in the morning, and they thought maybe their lines had something to do with it, maybe a spark, and they needed to check it out. So, people were running towards that idea right off the bat. And this is unusual for footage like this to make it to the national news, but it did in this case from CBS Weekend News. And I looked at this photograph for a long time trying to make sense. Is that the point of origin? Is that really where this fire started? And looking at sun angles and topography and maps and things, and I can't say that that's true one way or another, nor should I, with everything that's happened and the investigations that are going on. But we could use this for a minute to talk about silvicultural treatments. Let's assume that the fire started underneath these power lines that are here, and I want you to notice a couple of things. Outside the power lines themselves, dead tree, dead tree, dead tree, all standing dead trees, and back here, down log, down log, down log, down log. Those are all trees that were killed 10 years ago.
And that's a lot of fuel.
In a fire, and they become flammable fuels this time.
Yeah.
And so you could just point out that had they been removed, it's possible that this fire would not have sparked the way it did and gotten up into the air, onto the wind, and blown so fast. So I offer that just as an example of what we mean when we're talking about fuel treatments and how they might make a difference. Another picture, and you see directly underneath the power lines flames, but not flames nearly as high as the ones that are out in the untreated forest.
So that area was relatively clear, and would it have burned itself out if there hadn't been fuel around it?
Possibly.
Possibly.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but it's possible.
That's probably a discussion that's been going on in court now for a while.
Probably be part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. On a landscape view, point of origin, Paradise way over there, and once again you can see that fire covered lots of ground that didn't have much tree cover on it. And so just a personal opinion that I'll throw out there, if it really did start under the power lines as those pictures depicted, and had there been fuel treatment in the adjacent areas, and the suppression crews would have gotten to things quickly, it's possible that that could have made a difference. But once the burning embers hit the wind, The 60-mile-an-hour winds that were there that day is what blew the fire into paradise.
And that's what caused it to cross those clear areas.
That's
It's
how
the embers in the air. Those clear areas didn't
Embers
transmit-
blowing a half a mile
didn't
to
transmit that fire at
3/4
all.
of
Yeah.
a mile
Yeah.
away and starting new fires that did, and it just
Right.
kept cascading.
So in a sense, it was a series of fires.
And when you have wind speeds like that, there's not a whole lot that any kind of treatment can do.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that what we've accomplished here today is just to get everybody thinking a little bit about how fires work, what could be done in the forest that might make a difference, and let's start thinking about how we can adapt to the fires of the future.
There's a lot on the line. A lot of loss of property, loss of life, and it's good that the message gets out, and it's good that cool heads prevail, and that we manage our forests more properly. Yeah?
Thanks for having me today.
Well, Michael, thank you. I enjoy this. I think this is the third time I've heard this presentation, and I enjoy it more each time. I really appreciate what you do. Thank you. Okay. And thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to check back in. There's more to come. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.